Story number 1. The storm didn't start in the sky. It started between the three of us, coiled and waiting, long before the clouds remembered how to split open. When the rocks sealed the mouth of the cave, I thought we were trapped with the dark. I didn't realize we were trapped with the truth. A camera flash found the cave first. A stranger's voice found us second. But it was a confession that dug the deepest hole. I have slept in forests my whole life, and yet that night I learned the wildest animal is the story people tell themselves to survive. Years later, a Christmas card with a shaky signature would prove that rescue can arrive once in a lifetime and echo for decades. I used to measure my life in trailheads and blazes. Back in the 90s, when the map was a superstition and our boots were the only language we trusted. There were 3 of us who used to go wilderness hiking. Ashley, with her analog camera and endless caution. Sarah, with her restless humor and a pack full of snacks. And me, driver, planner, believer in the quiet sense of the trees. That weekend, we chose a dirt road that kept going long after responsible people would have turned back. And we let it lead us to a place the guidebooks never bothered to lie about. The day was young enough to forgive us anything. We parked, hiked until midday, and laid out a small lunch in the corridor of pines. Ashley was a photographer, and every shot cost her a portion of the future, so she chose carefully. Nothing wasted on maybes. That's why I noticed when she took 1, 2, 3 frames in quick succession, her flash punching daylight into a curtain of vines. The light drew our attention to a seam in the world, a cave withdrawn behind greenery, its entrance half hidden, like a mouth remembering to smile. We argued softly about caution. Sarah joked about bear dens, then shrugged because the forest felt oddly civilized here, as if old dangers had retired with the last ranger who remembered their names. We eased through, climbing over stones that seemed placed by either time or intent. Inside, the air had that dry, dusty, musky patience of long storage. There was a fire pit in the center, the ceiling punctured by a narrow skylight, and the floor held very old remains of someone else's evenings. Char, grit, the grammar of past heat. We set our bags near the wall and decided to make the cave our shelter. Why pitch a tent when the earth had already built one? We cooked outside in the last clean light, then arranged our pads in the back, completely sheltered from whatever the sky might invent. The first thunder didn't travel. It arrived. The storm laced itself across the ridge, and then the ridge answered by letting go. A rain of rocks fell down over the cave entrance, a terrible, grinding certainty. Moonlight vanished from the doorway, only a pale hole in the ceiling. High above, trickled light like a memory of God. Morning was a thin apology. None of us had slept. All of us felt rubbed raw by the dark. We tried the stones. We failed the stones. They were slick with rain and stubborn with weight. We ate in silence under the skylight, the cave breathing around us like a patient animal. I turned to the blockage again, prying at a seam, when their argument uncoiled at my back. Whispers first, then voices with edges. It was about Tyler, because it was always Tyler, the gravitational mistake in Ashley's life, the partner who flirted with absence even when he was in the room. I kept hoping it would fade, like distant weather. Instead, it metastasized into the kind of honesty that hurts even if it saves you. Ashley accused. Sarah countered. I asked a simple question. Had there been anything between them? Sarah, did you sleep with Tyler? The cave swallowed the words and returned them to us. Sarah looked at me first, then at Ashley, and said yes. She didn't just admit. She escalated. Details no one had asked for. Comparisons no one deserved. It was needless precision. Cruelty shaped like certainty. It struck me then. Sarah was a smoker, and she hadn't touched a cigarette since the rocks came down. Some courtesies survive, even when loyalties don't. The part of Ashley that refused the world finally refused the air. She rushed Sarah, drove her to the ground, and they grappled across the stone. I stepped forward, then stopped. Stepping in felt like choosing a version of the past. The cave amplified everything. Their fury, our breath, the brittle clatter of what we'd believed about each other. That racket rescued us. A voice fell through the skylight, a dry river of baritone, asking what mess we thought we were making of his quiet morning. He had a beard that belonged to a different century, one blind eye, and a calm that could stack stones without using hands. He said his name later, Bob. But in the first seconds, he was just the embodiment of help. He started from the top, working the slide from the outside while we pushed what we could from within. It was ridiculous labor made sacred by urgency. At last, a boulder popped free, and the cave inhaled daylight like it had been starving. Bob ducked to the opening, took us in, and winked, as if to say we were salvageable after all. We squeezed through to the road of living. Sarah, the largest of the group, came last. Ashley refused to offer a hand, and I can't blame her. Outside, the world wore yesterday's rain and today's mercy. Bob told us to drive safe and maybe get checked out at the clinic. I asked him to ride along, shotgun, not because we were lost, but because safety sometimes means adding a witness. He nodded. Back seats got ghosts, he said, and climbed in. The drive to town was an hour measured not in miles, but in grudges. The clinic was small, the kind of place where the nurse knows your dog's name. Ashley had a cut that carried infection, and she was dehydrated, an answer that made sense of her confusion and made nonsense of mine. She had to stay overnight. Sarah left on a bus that afternoon, a new story starting somewhere I didn't need to follow. When Tyler arrived with flowers, the room adjusted its posture. Bob set a large hand on Ashley's shoulder, stood, and redirected the conversation with a look that had edited better men. He stepped to Tyler, offered the gesture of a handshake, then replaced it with a lesson. Nothing cruel, nothing that left a mark, just enough to inform arrogance. It had reached the edge of its jurisdiction. Tyler asked which time Bob meant, and that answer was the only confession we required. He left. The flowers discovered their proper habitat, a trash can beside a machine that hummed out conditioned air. I never expected to see Bob again. He lived where maps stop. I gave him my home address because rituals matter. A Christmas card is a way of confirming two people survived the same year. For 8 winters, he sent them. Pictures of a cabin buried to the windows, of journals he was binding himself, of a grandson who could split a log without splitting his patience. The last letter wasn't in his hand. The grandson wrote that Bob had died, that he'd found my name in a list with notations like, "Send a card, saved some girls once." As if we were a chore he loved to repeat. If this were a fairy tale, I'd tell you the grandson and I met for coffee, and the story would find a new way to rescue itself. Maybe that happened. Maybe I'm too old to name certain kinds of luck out loud. I will tell you this much. My firstborn is named Robert, and when he stands under trees, he doesn't fidget. He watches the light do its slow, honest work. He asks for trails instead of toys, for maps instead of screens. Some rescues keep happening long after the rocks are moved. As for Ashley and Sarah, there are absences we can live with and absences we can't. I wrote to Ashley that winter. She wrote back that she'd finally learned what to want. Silence without suspicion. Doors without locks. She was learning to aim the camera at mornings. I once believed the cave was the center of the story, because that's where the storm cornered us. Now I think the center is Bob's wink through rock dust and daylight. Proof a stranger can place a hand on the ruined geometry of your day and make it add up again. When I hike now, I carry fewer certainties and better water. The woods have not changed their policies. Storms still arrive without an appointment. But I know this. When the way forward collapses, someone with a calm voice might already be climbing down to meet you. The world is full of sealed openings and unlikely witnesses. The trick is to shout when you must, listen when you can, and leave your address with the parts of the earth that deserve to write back. And if you gals don't shut your harpy yapping, that line still makes me smile. He was teasing when he said it, trying to glue us back together with a little frontier theater. The glue didn't hold, but that's all right. Not every rescue is a reconciliation. Sometimes it's just a door where there used to be a wall, and a way to walk out into weather that can finally see you. Story number 2. I didn't believe the forest could judge me until it remembered my name. I didn't believe love could turn into theater until the stage lights were the sun through red leaves. I didn't believe a joke could feel like a crime until my legs decided to flee before my mind could object. I didn't believe in monsters until I recognized the shoes beneath the costume. I don't hike anymore without checking who's holding the map and who's holding my heart. I was the kind of city girl who paints landscapes from photographs and calls it fresh air. I thought my ex-boyfriend was a great guy. I really did. He said hiking would be good for us, sweat as couples therapy, pine needles as confetti. He talked about a loop trail like it was a wedding ring, round, simple, sealed. Summer was turning into fall, and the colors were breathtaking. I packed snacks that didn't require instructions and a roll of toilet paper because my mother raised me practical. He packed confidence he'd borrowed from a catalog. He drove us to a trailhead with a grin that tried to pass for competence. He'd hiked these woods dozens of times, he told me. He was a quote-unquote expert on the area. The plan sounded harmless. A short day hike, a motel night, and then a 2-night camping trip, as if the forest were a theme park, and he had the fast pass. These woods were absolutely stunning. Maple and birch burned quietly in the afternoon light. My hands itched for brushes and an easel. My heart tried to trust him instead. He teased me when I hesitated at the start, the way people who are afraid of being afraid tease others first. Pride took the lead. I walked ahead, letting the trail fold behind us. We kissed once in a patch of sunlight that smelled like sap and warm rock. And for 5 minutes, the world was a postcard. Then he took the front again, confident strides that ignored the absence of blazes, the way a liar ignores punctuation. Aaron knew this place like the back of his hand. After all, he'd said. So I pressed my worries down like air bubbles in resin and watched them shimmer beneath the surface. We ate cheap lunch on a fallen log. When I reached for toilet paper, he looked scandalized, as if biology were rude. Isn't that common knowledge? I wanted to ask. A man who claims wilderness fluency should at least admit nature has plumbing rules. I kept my sarcasm holstered. When I returned, he had shouldered both our packs, impatient to move forward, always forward, as if retreat itself were a personal enemy. The light thinned. The air learned a cooler language. We couldn't be hiking through the deep woods in the pitch darkness, even with those X-Files level flashlights. He shrugged, suggested darkness might make it more exciting. My stomach sank. I suggested turning back. His mouth flattened into a thin, white horizon. He spun, chose a direction that felt wrong in a way my inner compass could taste. I tried to correct him gently. His replies sharpened until words were knives, bounced off trees. I started to genuinely feel a little unsafe around him. Heat and ego are cousins. He snatched my water, wasted half of it on the ground, and told me I worried too much. Bro, admit it. We're lost. I didn't call him bro, but I did accuse him of not listening. He answered with a mythology of competence. He read the sun like scripture. We were nearly back. I asked him to look at the GPS tracker. He produced the sealed box like a magician who forgot to learn the trick. He hadn't even set it up or charged it. When I pointed that out, anger lit his eyes from underneath, a fuse hidden in leaves. I moved softly. He erupted. Aaron began screaming at me, not with volume alone, but with the ugliness that refuses to hear itself. The word he chose for me was a shortcut to power, tossed like poison. Then came the proclamation. If I was so sure I was right, I should find my own way back. He marched toward a darkness even the trees seemed to refuse. There's a moment after someone abandons you, when your name acquires weight. Mine fit in my mouth like flint. I ate a granola bar to keep my hands busy and my spine firm. I checked the angle of the light, remembered the parking lot tucked below a ridge like an afterthought, and chose a path that felt like memory more than math. The woods rewarded steadiness. A gnarled trunk I had wanted to paint, a snag of bark like a dragon's eye, a snapped twig, mine, pointing home. I was doing fine. Better than fine. Confidence arrived without apology. That was when the voice found me. It didn't belong to the trees. It was too bright. A stage lamp in a chapel. High, mocking, practiced. The kind of voice that wants an audience before it wants a target. It floated between trunks, trailed by threats, acted out to the cheap seats. I ran, but not blindly. I kept the terrain folded inside my chest, counted steps between landmarks, refused the narcotic of panic. The voice promised trophies no human should be. The forest held its breath and let me pass. I found a hollow stump that smelled like old rain and slid inside. The voice drifted, then lied. I see you. It didn't. It wanted my fear more than my location. I moved again, low and quiet. A shadow committed to surviving itself. Through brush, I saw a figure with its back to me, peeking from behind a tree. The counterfeit drawl scratched the air. Where are you, little piggy? Piggy, pig, pig. The words echoed wrong. The shoes were wrong. The shoulders were wrong. I knew those shoes. Outlet store confidence. Size 11. It was freaking Aaron. The mask wasn't rubber. It was arrogance. He'd been following me through the woods, trying to put the fear of God into me. Theater, not murder. Or perhaps a rehearsal that didn't care what opening night required. The knowledge tasted like a coin on my tongue. Decision time. Give him the scene he wanted, or starve the play. I chose trickery. I tossed a rock into the opposite brush. He turned hard toward the sound, an actor obeying stage direction. I slid the other way, kept a maple trunk between us, and let gravity be my co-conspirator, down a slope scattered with leaves. The parking lot appeared the way mercy sometimes does, suddenly, simply. Exactly there, the car waited, loyal the way machines are. I considered abandoning him to whatever lesson the dark would provide. Conscience argued for a lesser verdict. Get out alive. Get out clean. I sat with both hands on the wheel and a licensed answer in my lap, under my purse. A quiet reminder that I was not helpless. I leaned on the horn in disciplined bursts, a lighthouse of sound. He emerged at last, looking embarrassed, but still a little smug, as if he'd successfully auditioned for the role of boyfriend who teaches valuable lesson. I drove. Asphalt cooled the fever that red leaves had given the day. He tried the voice again, like a party trick, expecting my laughter to notarize his genius. I said I'd been hunted and had believed I would die. He confessed, proud of his realism, expecting gratitude for the terror. I asked him quietly if he had meant to kill me. Horror moved over his face like weather. The possibility had never visited him. That was its own indictment. We rode in a silence that learned to breathe through its nose. At a highway gas station, I asked for a peace offering shaped like a hot dog. He reached for the door. I thanked him by leaving. The tires hummed their small hymn. The road agreed. At the next stop, I read his messages, bloom and rot. Apology, accusation, insult, demand. I told him to call a car or flag a trucker and pray his stories stayed fiction. I blocked him and let the ringtone go extinct. That could have been the end. But endings are stairs. Sometimes you descend them twice before you realize they're not a cliff. 2 mornings later, I set up my easel in my living room to paint the tree I'd wanted to paint. The brush trembled like a compass near a magnet. The forest had crawled into my sleep and hung lights. I decided to go back, not to him, not even to the same trail, but to the piece of myself still crouched in a stump. I called a friend who carries calm the way some people carry knives. We returned with printed maps, charged batteries, layers packed sensibly, and an agreement. Fear is information, not a tyrant. We walked the ridge under a blank, forgiving sky. My friend listened while I told the story in a voice that tried for clinical and failed. At the overlook, the parking lot lay below, like a promise I'd kept. We took the long loop, found the gnarled tree, and I painted fast and grateful while my friend read a paperback, and the day behaved itself. Footsteps approached, breath held, then released. It was a ranger, green uniform, steady presence. He asked about our hike. My friend, blessed with good timing, told him why we came back. His face changed to weather that made me feel safe. People pull stunts, he said. We try to educate. Sometimes we cite. I asked what for. Recklessness, he said. Public endangerment, if the story's true. I gave a statement. Not to punish him, though a part of me wanted the universe to keep a ledger, but to file my fear where it could stop pretending to be a private ghost. The ranger thanked us and pointed to a Saturday class on backcountry basics. We signed up. It felt like learning a language where no sentence has to end with an apology for existing. Weeks later, an unknown number called. A mutual friend said Aaron had been telling an abridged version at parties, casting me as hysterical and himself as misunderstood comedian. I let him finish and offered the only punchline I had left. The funniest thing about the whole story is how unfunny fear is when you're inside it. He was quiet. He asked to hear my side. I said my side belonged to me and to the woods that taught it to me. Absolutely the weirdest vacation I've ever had. The weirdest guy I ever dated. And thankfully, the weirdest scary story I have to share at parties. Only now, when I tell it, I don't give the monster a voice. I give the girl a map. If there's a moral, it's this. Respect is the only compass that doesn't lie. And if the forest ever speaks in a voice you recognize, don't debate it. Put your feet on the path you chose. Keep walking until the lot opens, like a mouth stunned silent by your survival. Story number 3. I was not supposed to live past that weekend. The forest held a name that didn't show up on any map. He never missed, even when he wanted to. We met a stranger who wore the wrong face and the right smile. When the last shot cracked the air, it felt like permission to leave. We hiked to get small. Out there, the trees scaled our voices down until even arguing became a private gesture. A hand moving, a chin tilting, a breath held back. Mikey said the woods cleaned the copper taste off his tongue that city nights left behind. I said the woods emptied the inbox inside my skull. The truth is, we both liked testing the edges of our luck where no one else could see. On the second evening, the fire was an orange coin in a bowl of dark. Fat hissed on the pan, and the smell of meat turned the pines into a cathedral. We were not talking. We were listening to the ordinary music of being alive outdoors. That was when a voice spoke from right behind us, the distance of a handshake. The voice had the quiet of a person who liked to arrive after the door had already been opened. "Evening, fellas," he said, and stepped into the wreath of light. He had the wrong face for a place like this. It took my mind a second to slot the features together. The glasses, the soft angles, that boyish smirk I'd seen on movie posters and nostalgia blogs, Corey Feldman's face, or a faked echo of it, layered over a body too tall by a couple inches, a cheek marred by a small white scar that didn't belong in any headshot. He wore a surplus jacket and a cap the color of a bruise. He moved like a person who had practiced moving, who wanted you to notice how unhurried he was. He plucked a steak off our pan with 2 fingers and sat like a cousin who knew our mother. Mikey and I traded a look. Hospitality in the wild is a gun without a safety. We offered him water, the extra tin cup, a seat that wasn't really there. He introduced himself as Buck. A sentence later, he said friends called him Bucky. A minute after that, he corrected us. His name was Buck. I marked it down in my head. A man testing how people would arrange themselves around his preferences. He talked like a myth, auditioning for a place in the modern world. He said people told him he looked like Adam Sandler. And when I said he reminded me more of Corey Feldman, he smiled without joy, like a teacher hearing the wrong answer for the 100th time. He volunteered that some of his buddies called him Kyle, after Chris Kyle, the American sniper, and he let the reference hang, inviting us to pull it down and polish it with awe. He began to unspool stories in a tone calibrated to be overheard by the trees. Weeks in prone, shots across miles, wind calls that sounded like he could hear God breathing between ridgelines. The details didn't add up, but the confidence did. The man collected identities, like other folks collected bottle caps. Mikey is a good drunk, warm-blooded and easily amused. And the more this stranger talked, the more Mikey's amusement sharpened. I watched irritation creep into Buck's posture, the way cold creeps into a shoulder. The smile became orthodontic, a structure holding anger in place. He told us about a ricochet that had saved a woman and her unborn child. Mikey interrupted with a question about geometry and the thickness of sheet metal, a question with a punchline sewn into it. The stranger stood, hand throwing a shadow toward his waistband. I stood with him, and the pistol I carry for the wilderness came up like a reflex I had rehearsed 1,000 times. For one breath, it was only our eyes in the firelight. His a little too bright behind those thick lenses, mine dull and careful. Mikey sobered by standing still. "Easy," the man said, and the word had more threat than any slur. He declared the land his, the night his, our presence a trespass that he could correct, legally or otherwise. Then he left the circle of our fire, the way a fish slides back into a river. The darkness took him carefully, like it knew him and owed him something. We did not sleep much, and what little sleep we got was full of trees rearranging themselves. Morning was an apology the sky made with pastel and clean wind. We packed camp faster than we ever had. Cords coiled pretty, ashes drowned black. We started the long walk toward the truck, promising each other we wouldn't talk about last night unless the forest asked us to. It asked with a sound that wasn't supposed to be here, a flat, distant crack, the kind of sound that erases all the others. Bark splintered from a trunk 20 feet ahead, a wet starburst that made a silent snow. No one visible, no warning, no demand, just proof. We shouted the things hikers shout when they are desperate to be seen as human. Here we are, minds our own. Bright jackets. Don't make a mistake. Another shot stitched the same hole. The precision was a signature. Whoever was up there had a standard to keep. We dropped behind a fir with a trunk wide enough to host a family of secrets. I felt the small theater of decisions open inside me. Run and invite a test, or wait and accept humiliation. I tossed a metal bottle into the gap the way a magician tosses a dove. The bottle jinked left as if it had chosen a team. Then it became two pieces of metal singing against the duff. There are different kinds of silence in the aftermath of a perfect shot. This one sounded like the shooter had tilted his head to see how we'd respond. "Buck," I called, and hearing the name in my own mouth felt like I had just said a spell I didn't know. The trees kept their counsel. Another surgical hit punched bark from the same scar on that far trunk, a measure kept by an unseen metronome. I told myself that was a no, that if he wanted us erased, we would already be dust. Mikey nodded, like a man agreeing to a contract he hadn't read. We traveled like fugitives from gravity, low, indirect, counting cover the way you count beads when prayer is a measurement of time. The shots kept coming, far apart, each one an essay on control. By afternoon, the pattern felt personal. He would clip a twig the width of a pencil, then center a whorl on a trunk from some impossible angle, then hold his fire through a crossing where killing us would have been trivial. It was artistry, and it was cruelty, and I couldn't decide which part felt worse. You learn a person by how they play with you. Our shooter wanted to be admired without being seen. He wanted to write on the world with a tool that most people treat like an argument. He wanted to keep us alive so we could understand what living meant when someone else owned the air around you. Light thinned, then evaporated. Hunger became a theory we didn't have time to test. We ditched what weight we could, kept water and heat, surrendered the easy comforts. My legs took on the steady burn of an engine designed for one job. Time lost edges. The forest tightened around us until even thinking loud felt dangerous. Near midnight, the wind changed and brought a smell I could not place. Cold metal, machine oil, something clerical, a scent like an office where every drawer is locked. We froze. No shot came. In that gap, I realized the forest had never once offered us an echo of the man's position. The geometry was too tight, as if the trees themselves were colluding. I whispered to Mikey that the man might have dressed ordinary, but he moved like terrain had signed a non-disclosure agreement. Dawn found us smaller than when we started, less rhetorical. It also found the gravel glare of the trailhead through a lace of branches that I will never forget. Our truck sat where we had left it, dumb and intact, waiting the way a dog waits, wholehearted. We stood in the tree line and did not move. Two men afraid of arriving. We listened. 10 minutes became a hand pressing between our shoulder blades. Then, from far off to the left, a single report, thin and clean, like a door closing in another wing of the house. I felt the oddest relief, a message I did not know how to translate. We walked out. I kept my hands visible to the sky. Mikey carried the keys like a religious object. There was a gift on the windshield, placed just so, a brass cylinder with its mouth blackened. I recognized the curve and the stamp even before the word fully formed. Winchester. And the old dread turned a page. We put it in a bag, as if that could stop it touching us. The town had one street with two speeds, glacial and funeral. The sheriff wore the uniform like a man who was tired of suns. The story came out of us in the office's low light, gathered and smoothed by adrenaline's gone quiet fingers. I handed over the bagged brass. Mikey talked about the way the bark had exploded into a brown halo. I stuck to the facts you can carry without dropping. Timing, angles, the shape of our fear. The sheriff listened with a patience that looked inherited. When we said the name Buck, his expression did a small, careful thing, and he asked us to follow. The cells out back smelled like old coffee and apologies. On a bench, in a posture that only hangovers can sculpt, sat the man with the borrowed face. He looked up at us and tried on a smile that would have fit in our firelight. Buck, or Bucky, or Kyle, had been in the drunk tank since the night before, brought in for a DUI that the town would talk about as if it had happened to them. The math closed like a fist. Whoever had written on the air with a rifle had not sat at our fire to explain his resume. The man in the cell shrank into someone comprehensible, a talker with stories that had never been forced to carry their own weight, a man who needed us to believe him because he couldn't. He admitted to placing the casing on our truck as a joke, or an apology, or a claim. The sheriff said a team would walk the site, but we'd been in a hunting forest. Evidence there was a crowd with many faces. Mikey looked like a person who wanted to punch a mirror and keep the glass in his knuckles. I looked at the man with the wrong face and felt that same odd mercy I'd felt in the trees. Something dangerous had allowed us to leave. And that allow mattered. We told the story to ourselves. Over the years, the way people tell stories, they are afraid to finish. We gave the shooter a name we had stolen from a video game. Metal Gear Solid had an old man in a chair who turned photosynthesis into legend. We called our ghost The End, capital letters and all, because he reduced us to the smallest words. The Goonies, Lost Boys, Friday the 13th, Part 3, Stand By Me. All those titles we'd thrown around that night were kids' myths compared to what had walked parallel to us through the pines. Sometimes Buck emails. He forwards links about satellites and black sites, about how the government has learned to see through bark and bone. Sometimes he's affable, a man who can make you laugh twice before the beer warms. I think he wants us to keep him in the story, to let him orbit the event that could have belonged to him if the world were kinder to liars. We don't go back to that piece of the forest. The rest of the state has more trees than any one man needs, and we take them like pills. Careful with the dose. I carry 2 extra magazines now, and a habit of looking for high ground even on flat streets. Mikey started running in the mornings, as if his legs could keep the past from catching up after all, when I can't sleep. I go back to the moment before that last far-off shot. I stand in the trees and stare at the truck until my eyes water. I imagine the man up on some slope, his scope making a tunnel through the air between us, his finger disciplined and bored. In that version, I speak first, not to beg, not to bargain, to thank him for not taking the easiest shot of his life. He doesn't answer. In my mind, he never will. That's what frightens me most. Not the power he had, but the restraint. Anyone can decide to end a thing. It takes another kind of hunger to let it continue. I think about the brass case cooling on the windshield, the way the sun would have warmed it, the thumb and finger that set it down, the ritual that requires witnesses who won't understand. I think about the word Winchester and how it sounds like a surname that keeps burying men. I think about how we can live under a crosshair for an hour and still come home and wash our hands and laugh about the weird guy with the movie star face. On good nights, I tell myself he was exactly what we named him. A relic, photosynthetic and patient. A gardener pruning us back to size. On bad nights, I picture a younger man, part of a program with a budget and a motto, calibrating himself against random strangers because the official tests no longer interested him. On the worst nights, I tell the story in second person, and the pronouns push me into a place where the only true sentence is this: you did not see because someone else didn't feel like killing you. You mistake that for luck. And you go on, and you try to be worthy of the restraint that spared you. If you ask me why we keep hiking, I can only answer that retreat is not the same thing as safety. We choose different trailheads now, and we leave our fires small, and we talk less when the trees lean in. But we go, because the forest is a classroom where the lesson is repeated until you learn it. Being alive is not a right, it's an allowance. And somewhere, perhaps, a man with the wrong face waits for the perfect wind, not to erase us, but to write his signature again on air, thrifty as ever with his ammunition. If he is out there, if he is listening, I hope he knows this much. I remember how careful he was. Sometimes gratitude is a heavier thing to carry than fear. Story number 4. If you walk long enough into the timberline, the trees begin to speak in the voice of the people you miss. My grandfather taught me that. The forest kept his secrets, and I kept his last one. On the final hunt, he asked me to carry a lie and a truth into the dark. One to save him, one to save me. Eli had a name, Shatterpaw. The truth wore a human face and pointed a gun at mine. I was a storekeeper by the highway and a pilgrim after sunset, packing dry rations beside a coiled rope and a map that had more coffee stains than contour lines. Back in the late 90s, I was a teen with hopes, dreams, and above all, a love of the wilderness. That love was an inheritance that didn't come on paper. It came as a warm hand on my shoulder at dawn, a whistle that meant break camp, a nod that meant listen. My grandfather never needed to prove himself. The forest did that for him. I got this from my grandpa, not as a rule book, but as a rhythm. Step, breathe up, step, breathe, until muscles stopped being yours and started being the mountains. In town, you would absolutely never have known what kind of guy he was. He tucked his shoulders into shirts that smelled faintly of starch and ledger ink, smiled at bank tellers, paid in exact change. Out past the logging road, he became someone else entirely. a man with calluses, where most folks kept excuses. By the time I often went hunting with him, he'd retired from the office job, and I only really knew the version of him the Pines approved. He was my first compass, my first quiet. Family drifted like smoke after the good fire goes out. Grandma got sick and passed away. Mom and Dad went their separate ways, and the kind of friction that wears out even tools wore out conversations at our table. My sister built a different life. I built a small business and a porch where Grandpa could sit on a rocker and wave at strangers like they were cousins. We traded stories the way other men trade receipts. I kept asking him to move in with me and my partner. He refused with the stubborn grace that old men learn. An art of pretending their refusals are for your sake. He said the walls in our place were too honest. His smoke would cling to them like regret. I told him I barely smelled anything. He said my partner did, and he would never be the cause of a headache in a home someone else had to love. It rained the day he handed me the envelope. It was a letter from an oncologist, and I didn't have to read the whole thing to know that some words have a gravity to them. Brain tumor, inoperable. To grow up is to learn which syllables can bend a life. I asked him why he seemed lighter, not heavier. He told me that age didn't make endings cruel. It made them legible. He cradled the news the way he cradled a rifle, steady, with his cheek to it, as if death were just a far ridge he'd always intended to cross. He spoke about seeing Grandma again, and I realized the bravest men aren't unafraid. They're honest about what they're tired of fighting. We sat quiet until the rain on the window wrote the answer for me. And then I asked, "Hey, Grandpa, is there anything you want to do before the end?" He didn't hesitate. He had one that got away. The words changed the room like a sudden draft. He wanted a final hunting trip, not for trophies, but for proof that the person he'd been was still inside the body. Medicine had started to number. We planned without saying the word plan. We chose the old ridge as if it were a church, and we were choosing pews. The old man needed a cane sometimes, and pride the rest of the time. He rejected the wheelchair the way he had always rejected anything with an easy handle. Our pace was a stubborn prayer. 4 days to do what used to take one. The trail unspooling under our boots, while the past threaded itself through every pause. We rested often. We talked more. On day 5, we pitched up camp, and Grandpa said that this was it. He named the grove like he was naming a child. He waited till the sunset, and then he sat me down and told me about the one that got away. He called it Shatterpaw. Not a myth, exactly. More like the absence that myths leave behind. A track that looked like a broken handprint. A watcher at distance, standing there in the far tree line, whispering into his thoughts, as if thoughts were a trail camera he couldn't turn off. He had seen it 6 or 7 times in his life, he said. And if death were coming anyway, he wanted to meet it moving uphill. I told myself to play along, not because I believed, but because love doesn't always arrive as agreement. It arrives as the willingness to carry another's need until it becomes a shape your own hands recognize. Of course, my reaction was to assume that the brain tumor was starting to do its business. But what business was it of mine to steal his last pilgrimage? I prepared the safer version of our story. I had actually disabled the firing pin in his long gun. The metal would click and pretend to work, and no living thing would have to pay the price for our nostalgia. The truth is, I was afraid of giving grief a trigger. I trusted the mountains. I didn't trust fate. Night came like an argument we were too tired to finish. We cooked burgers over the camp stove and turned in. A few hours later, Grandpa touched my shoulder and asked whether I could smell it. I couldn't. He said most folks can't. It was an oddity of the beast itself, a stench only 10% of the population could parse. I almost laughed, but the way he looked past me into the dark stopped me. He was listening to something I couldn't hear, the same way he used to cock his head at a faraway stream and find water before anyone else could. He stepped outside. I followed with my rifle and a pocket of guilt. When I stepped out of the tent, Grandpa had lit the bonfire. Sparks rose, and the trees wore them briefly like jewelry. I asked where the thing was. He looked at me and said, "I think you know." Then he pulled a revolver from his waistband. That was the first time I learned that love can be a heist. He told me he'd known all along that I'd sabotage his gun, that he had taken the pistol because there are endings a man won't ask another to give him unless he's ready to be refused. He pointed the revolver at me. I saw the tremor in his hand and the tear he didn't bother to wipe away. He said that if I wanted to prove I wasn't the monster, I should do what monsters don't do: drop my gun. So I did. He seemed smaller and larger at the same time, like a mountain seen from two valleys at once. I told him I understood. Not the part about me being a creature born out of his fear. He later admitted the TV room had offered him that plot. But the part about wanting control over the last page. He was a die-hard Christian who believed exit wounds could be sins. He was trying to hand me a story where my guilt could be traded for heroism. I refused the trade. I told him we would walk out together, however slow, however much it hurt. Then the forest adjudicated. A shadow separated from shadow. He yelled, "Get down!" I moved. 3 shots fell into the night like sentences, not sounds. And the body that hit the ground wasn't mine. A cougar had readied itself behind me while we argued about mercy. The old man had put the creature down with the first shot. The world narrowed to breath and after breath. He stood there with the pistol loose at his side. A man who had wanted to die and had chosen, again, to keep me alive instead. We didn't speak for a long time. Speech seemed like the one thing that could break what we had just kept whole. We wrapped the cat in our spare sleeping bag and started back with a burden that was proof and parable both. It took us 5 days to hike back, and the food went from enough to nearly. I learned that hunger sharpens gratitude like a blade. The ridge gave way to road. The road gave way to town. We paid a taxidermist who still smokes too much and still gets the eyes right. We gave the creature a posture that looked less like pride and more like apology. We displayed it in my store with a plaque that didn't try to be the whole truth. I watched Grandpa's health unravel like a rope that had held too many rescues. A cough became a lung infection, and the word cancer stopped being a diagnosis and became a geography we could cross only once. He slept more and spoke less, which is how good men rehearse for farewell. We sat by the display once after closing. He asked me whether I would keep the cat forever. I said nothing is forever. Stores close. Museums adopt what private love can't. He said that was right. Then he told me again about the first time he saw Shatterpaw, not because he needed me to believe it, but because naming a thing is how the dying leave doors ajar. He wanted a door left somewhere in the world that still had his handprint on it. The last week was soft. The nurses knew how to move around a sleeping man without waking his stories. I brought him photographs that remembered us better than we remembered ourselves. He held them, not like paper, but like low flames. He asked me once more to tell him the exact moment I dropped my rifle. I told him the truth I wanted him to die with, that I didn't drop it out of fear, but out of love. He nodded the way men nod when the answer fits the shape of their chest. He said he swore he didn't make up the Shatterpaw itself. I didn't argue. Faith has never needed my permission. After the funeral, I donated the mount to a county exhibit about 10 years later, when the store changed hands and the porch lost its habit of catching strangers. I still have photos somewhere from the days before digital. I don't look for them. I prefer the version in my head, where the cat's glass eyes watch over a counter, while a bell on the door rings acquaintance into friendship. I heard visitors ask the curator where the name Shatterpaw came from. The curator shrugged. The label doesn't say. I never corrected him. Some names belong to the living. Some belong to the ones who taught us how to carry them. Sometimes people write to me with links and theories, footage of upright silhouettes, sound bites of what could be anything. Wind, creek, human fear. I write back rarely. When I do, I tell them that the forest is not a courtroom, and evidence is a poor translation for wonder. Whenever I try to look it up, I can't find a single piece of evidence of a thing called Shatterpaw. That's fine. Wonder doesn't need a search result. It needs a witness. I've already been one. When I pass the trailhead where we made camp, I stop. I talk, out loud, to a man who once pretended I was a monster so I wouldn't have to live as his executioner. I thank him for choosing, in the only moment it mattered, to be my grandfather more than he was his fear. If you go to that ridge, the pines will lean the way they do when winter rehearses in autumn. You'll see a stump that could be an altar and a scar in the soil where a fire once talked to the air. You won't find tracks. Tracks are just the universe practicing how to erase us. You might, if you're lucky, feel watched. If that happens, turn slowly. If you see nothing, that's the point. Not every pair of eyes that saves you lives in a skull. Some of them live in memory and refuse to blink. So here's my last confession. I don't know whether Shatterpaw exists. I know the man who named it did, and that he loved me enough to test the road between us with something heavier than proof. If you ever meet it, if you ever feel a message threading its way into your bones from the edge of a clearing, speak my name kindly. Tell it made an old man very happy in his last days. Tell it this grandson kept the door open. And if you are that kind of rare soul who can smell what others can't, you'll catch the trace of cigar smoke and cedar oil just past the campfire ring. It won't be a monster. It will be a goodbye that never learned how to finish, a blessing that never learned how to fail.